A couple friends of mine listen to your podcast regularly and keep encouraging me to write into you with the story. Now, hopefully you find it as creepy as I did, because even though it happened over 15 years ago, it feels like yesterday whenever I remember it. To this day, I still don't know if I should have done something more than I did, and whenever I tell the story, nobody can give me a decisive answer of what they think I should have done either. So maybe you or your listeners can shed some insight or open my eyes to a new perspective. It drives me mad thinking about what else I could have done to help the guy in question in the story. Maybe because it ended with me being so helpless and useless to him. Now, for some background, when I was younger, I used to see myself as a bit of a wild explorer survivalist type. I had read all the books, seen all the shows, and kind of enjoyed having this air of rugged mystery to myself. I'm an extremely tall, broad fella, and combined with the sense of immortality you have in your early 20s, I felt pretty invincible. So all of this said, it's the reason why I spent a lot of my time camping by myself. One thing I'd say is that camping by yourself isn't actually the best idea. There's a whole bunch of things that can go wrong, especially if you're deep in the wilderness. If you need help, there's likely going to be nobody around to offer it, and if you come up against any adversity, man or nature, then more often than not, your body's going to be food for the crows, never to be found. Now, I've done my due diligence with warning you about the dangers. I can say that my years camping by myself are freaking awesome. There's nothing like braving it in nature all by yourself, knowing that your own survival relies solely on you and your decisions, and that one wrong step could send you spiraling to your doom, sometimes literally if you stumble off a cliff in the dark. Now, thankfully, I never managed to injure myself in that kind of way, which is a miracle when I look back at how reckless and stupid I could get. At the time, like I said, I enjoyed being a quiet, stoic man of mystery, so I didn't often recount my adventures to friends either. But when I did, they'd always scold me for being so irresponsible and tell me that one day I'd end up dead in a tree. Always in a tree, too, according to one friend of mine who very much enjoyed the comforts of life. Not sure why he always assumed that I climbed into trees, but according to him, that's the way I was going to die. Maybe a leopard or something pulled me up there. I always laughed and brushed them off, and I don't think it really struck me at how correct they were until I found myself responsible for someone else's life. As much as I'd like to brag and tell you all about my death-defying exploits, it's this one final event towards the end of my camping days that really sticks with me. As I've said, I really focused on survival and isolation, so it was pretty rare for me to meet anyone else when I was out hiking. And so one day, 4 days into a planned 8-day hike, I was hella surprised when, almost out of nowhere, a guy came ambling into the clearing where I was setting up my tent. Immediately, I was on the defensive, being pretty much in the middle of nowhere and not having seen another living soul for days. And then, when I finally took in the guy's appearance, I felt more confused than defensive. Everything about this dude was wrong, at least in the middle of nowhere in the forest, that is. The main thing was that while I was decked out in full hiking gear, covered in mud and who knows what else, this guy was wearing what appeared to be a casual business suit. He looked like he'd just come strolling out of the office, at least in terms of what he was wearing. And the more I looked, though, the more disheveled I realized he was, and the more confused and scared he appeared to be. The first thing he said to me was to ask me where we were. I told him very gruffly and still in the defensive, and at first I wasn't sure that he'd heard me, because I have a tendency to sort of mumble and talk quietly. And then I realized his look of puzzlement was because he thought I was lying to him. We engaged in a bit more discussion, and I allowed myself to open up a little and accept that this dude wasn't out to kill me. I soon realized that he was very lost and unsure of himself. I kind of wondered if maybe he was drunk, but he also reminded me of when my great-grandma had suffered from dementia. There was this sort of glassy look in his eyes that disturbed me a little. Relaxing and deciding this guy wasn't a threat, I started being more gentle in how I spoke to him. I managed to coax the info out of him that he had no memory of how he'd woken up in the forest out here in the middle of nowhere, and the last thing he could remember was leaving work for about 4 days before. Either this guy had gone on the mother of all drinking binges, or he really was suffering some kind of severe head trauma. I tried asking if he could remember a blow to the head or anything like that, but he seemed completely unaware of anything that could have led him to where he is now. And let me just stress here for a moment, we really were out in the middle of nowhere. This wasn't somewhere that you could end up after wandering for an hour or so, or even for a day. And it really struck me how wild it was when the guy asked me for help in getting back to civilization, and we went over my map. Unless my wayfinding had somehow become way off, we were about 3 days from where I had left my vehicle in one direction, and about the same distance to the nearest town in the other. I figured that town must be where the guy had come from, and when I mentioned the name, his face actually brightened a little. He lived there with his girlfriend, he said, and he worked in the city during the week. Feeling kind of like an adventurer hero, I suggested to the guy that we camp out where I'd set up my tent so we could get some rest and warm some food up before we began the hike back to civilization the next day. It only struck me a bit later that I was inviting a stranger to watch over me while I slept, who could potentially be very dangerous whether knowingly or not. At the time, I didn't even really consider the ramifications of this, and like I said, I was young and reckless and arrogant. Thankfully, when I woke up the next day, the business suit guy hadn't murdered me in my sleep. He was in fact snoring in an extremely deep sleep, cramped up next to me in my one-man tent. I somehow managed to slip out without waking him and wash myself up, and then went about planning our most optimal route. I figured that I'd let this business guy sleep as long as he needed. We could even set out a day later if we had to, and I had enough provisions for probably at this point a year of survival, and the guy seemed to be in perfect physical health. Mentally, I wasn't sure, but I was confident that I could handle or wrangle this rogue businessman. But I prayed that he was just on something rather than suffering from head trauma or dementia. And after he'd woken up for the morning, it became clear that unfortunately this guy was suffering from some kind of mental issue though. He'd frequently drift off while talking to me, and his memory of lost events didn't seem to be any better than the previous night. Occasionally, I'd catch him looking at me in some strange way, almost hungrily or dangerously. And now it's probably obvious that I'm a stubborn idiot at this point, but at the time I refused to accept that this guy could be anything less than legitimate. Hell, maybe I'm only remembering these predatory looks by thinking back on it, I'm not really sure. But either way, I was at least sensible enough to insist that we head towards civilization that day. I loaned this guy some of my spare hiking gear, so he was at least a little equipped for the wilderness. And now that he wasn't wearing a suit, he almost passed as someone who belonged out there with me. And at the very least, he didn't unsettle me every time I looked at him. And as we walked through the woods, I realized that he was a surprisingly competent hiker. Too competent, it felt, looking back on it, but again, that just could be the benefit of hindsight. And as we walked, picking our way over some pretty rough terrain, the guy started talking about some fairly weird stuff. One thing that really sticks out to me was that he kept asking me what my views were on morality, specifically if I believed in an afterlife and what did I think happened to us after we die, etc. Again, looking back, this was really unsettling for a meeting with a stranger out of nowhere under these certain circumstances. Now back then, I kind of was pretentious though, sort of a wannabe intellectual, so I treated his weird conversation topic with sincerity. I guess maybe some of it was adrenaline and denial as well. There wasn't much I could actually do about being stuck out there with a super weird guy, so the best survival tactic I had was denial and to just keep pressing on. This guy really shouldn't have been able to keep up with me if he really was an unprepared, mentally sick guy who found himself in a situation like this. I'm absolutely certain of that now. At the time, though, he managed to keep pace with me despite being a lot shorter and smaller than me, and I really pushed us both through our paces. I should add, too, that the guy looked to be maybe late 30s, early 40s, and I was in my early 20s, so I guess there was a degree of wanting to impress my elders. And there was also the fact of being unaware of just how much difference that age gap should have made to his overall fitness if he was unprepared. After a day's hard hiking, I found a clearing that I previously camped in by myself and told the guy that we'd set the tent up here to take a break for the night. It was by a small creek, so it was a nice camping spot that I used a few times, and we both enjoyed a refreshing wash in the creek, and I settled in to share some rations with him. I hoped that by talking to the guy that I might be able to shake his memory loose, but all I got were these stories about his day job. Most of them sounded kind of made up, like he'd taken them from books or TV shows, but there was nothing I could prove to be a clear lie. The next day, after somehow surviving a second night sleeping next to this dude, we began again. Now I call this second day Predator Day, and thankfully not because business guy revealed himself as a predator, but because he became convinced that we were being stalked by one. Now I'd like to add at this point that the reason I continue to call him business guy is that he never actually told me his name, and I was too much of a hothead to slow down and really ask. And it started within an hour of us going out for the day. The business guy grabbed my arm and slowed me down. At first I got kind of defensive and thought, oh god, this is it. He's making his move. But I summoned my inner zen and I asked him what was up. He acted like I was stupid for not realizing it, but clammed up like it was some big secret. And then when I coaxed it out of him, he leaned in and whispered to me in a very exaggerated way to say that we were being followed. I told him we definitely weren't, that I'd trained myself to detect if I was being followed. I know I was kind of pretentious. I told you this already, but business guy sort of sneered at this and made as if he was going to say something smartass and then just didn't. Now looking back now, I'm convinced that he was going to say that I hadn't noticed him following me previously, but I can't be sure. I managed to convince him that we weren't being followed and to keep up the pace. About an hour later, he grabbed my arm again though and said something about how he was certain now we were definitely being stalked. Again, I told him we weren't, and I genuinely don't think we were. I asked him if he thought it was a person or a creature, and he said he wasn't sure. He said maybe it was a bear or a mountain lion, and I explained to him that neither of those animals were most likely going to be in this area, and that I definitely wouldn't be camping alone in an area with those kinds of things. Now the business guy sort of jeered at this as well, as if he knew better than me, and I reminded myself that this guy wasn't well mentally and I was just supposed to be helping him escape. Now some more time passed and the guy started really freaking out now. He was yelling for our stalker to come out and face us. He started shouting that we had a gun and weren't afraid to use it. Now as it happens, I did have a gun, a small pistol for protection, but I had made sure not to reveal that to this guy at any point, just in case. I wanted at least one piece of protection for if things went south. At this stage, I was fairly certain that they were about to go south too with all the screaming that this guy was doing. He acted so convinced and certain that we were being stalked that it started making me paranoid as well. And suddenly every movement was a threat. Every noise was an animal creeping up on us. Sure, bears and cougars weren't super common in this area at all, but that didn't mean that there couldn't be a stray killer animal out of its natural habitat, right? And at one point, I just about had a heart attack when a rabbit went dashing past us, disturbed by this business guy's yells. Now, I successfully managed to coax him into calming down and following me again, but this is where the guy starts to unravel. At the time, I assumed it was fatigue or illness affecting him, but sometimes when I play it back, I wonder if it was kind of a hunger. If this guy was planning on doing something terrible to me, and I stress that to this day I still don't know for sure, then maybe the itch to do it was getting under his skin. I don't know if maybe I was subconsciously thinking of this at the time, but I do remember that I pushed us real hard that day, and we continued hiking a while after the sun had gone down, which again is a really stupid thing to do, but at the time, I insisted that we'd be fine to hike by flashlight. I knew the area pretty well, and I also didn't want to stop while this business guy was still muttering about how we were being followed. Now, I'm fairly certain by the end of the day I was convinced that we were being followed too, even though I knew that that was impossible. Certainly, if we were being followed by an animal, it wouldn't have been able to stalk us unseen for an entire day. And finally, I allowed us to set up camp. And by my calculations, which were probably wrong looking back on it, we could reach my car by the next afternoon. I was feeling pretty pleased with myself at our progress. I was also still convincing myself that I'd saved this lost guy while ignoring all the red flags that I'd seen in retrospect. Or if not red flags, then at least pieces of evidence that proved things were entirely as they seemed at face value. I've retold this story countless times, and every time I do tell it, I remember something else I probably should have picked up on. And that night is where everything came to a head. We found a camping spot in the dark, as I said, which was a small miracle given how obscure the area was. My tent was one of those pop-out tents, so it wasn't hard to set up in the dark, and then go about setting up the portable camp heater that I'd been carting around. No campfires in unapproved areas, of course. At least I like to abide by the rules. And we sat around that heater for the third night, and I tried coaxing more memories or details out of this guy. And for the third night, he continued to insist that all he remembered was leaving work in the city and then waking up in the middle of the forest. Now, by now, even back then, I was really starting to question this whole thing, given that this guy had managed to hike back with me just fine despite being allegedly unprepared. I figured that if he hadn't killed me after 3 nights, then he wasn't going to, though, and he had some other reason for wanting me to guide him out of that forest. It felt safe to play along, is really what I'm trying to say. Now, we were ready to go to bed to our tents when the men came bursting into the clearing with flashlights. One of them shouted at me to stay calm and that everything was going to be okay now. Meanwhile, a couple of other guys had grabbed the business guy and were now handcuffing him. I squinted against the light shining in my face, trying to make out who these guys were. Now, the way they were acting, they seemed like they were FBI or some other kind of law enforcement agency, and I think they were wearing unmarked jackets, though, or at least I couldn't see any identifying marks in the dark. The guy who'd spoken to me flashed a badge at me, which looked vaguely legitimate, but again, it was very hard to tell in the nighttime. And I also couldn't see specifically which agency the badge was associated with, although in later years I've identified it as being almost certainly FBI. Now, it was an absolute whirlwind. This one guy, an agent or whatever he might have been, was constantly telling me to stay calm and that I was safe, almost as if he was trying to distract my attention from whatever was going on with that business guy. I tried to look around the man blocking my view while shielding my gaze from the flashlight in my eyes, and it seemed like they were bundling that guy away through the trees, and it struck me later that business guy didn't even say a word or make a sound throughout the whole ordeal. I swear I can remember him grinning as they took him away, but again, I could just be adding that detail in my mind. Now, eventually, it was just myself and 2 of the agents, including the one who repeatedly told me I was safe. I expected them to, I don't know, debrief me or something, at least explain the situation. But no, nothing. They literally told me that I was safe now, and that I'd avoided a terrible fate, and then headed off into the trees. Now, at the time, I was completely baffled. Of course, I didn't find out until later that I'd majorly miscalculated our entire route, so we were camping only about a half hour from the road. Finding this out later, it at least made sense how the men were able to locate and reach us, but it still left me with a few baffling and creepy questions. Who the hell was business guy? And why did he put on such a show of pretending to be a lost little sheep, if only to escort me back to my car? Was this the most elaborate carjacking ever? I don't know. And it also kills me not to know if the men who showed up were legitimate law enforcement or not. Either I got saved from some terrible fate or I handed business guy over to one. And over time, I've come to manage to convince myself that that guy had something awful planned for me. But that's only because the other possibility is probably too horrible to think about. What if I let a person in a genuine need get snatched up by God knows who? Now, I'm fairly certain that that guy was at least a bad player, though, because of a few things. 1. That night, after everything had died down and the men had left, I checked my pack for security. Now, I was horrified to discover that my gun, which I kept in a holster in a hidden compartment in the bag, was gone. The so-called law enforcement agents never went near my tent, so the gun could only have been taken by that business guy. And as I mentioned, I never told him about the gun. He must have been searching my belongings pretty thoroughly to find it. Secondly, I discovered that the small amount of money that I kept in the same pocket was also gone. Now, it was only about $100 or so, but enough to feel the sting at the time. And thirdly, when I reached the car the next morning, after finding I was much closer to the road than I thought, I made one final horrifying discovery. I have no proof that this was connected to the business guy in any way, but someone had slashed one of my tires. Thankfully only one, so I was able to replace it with a spare easily enough, but it was almost as if it had been done as a delaying tactic just in case. Maybe to give that guy the time to jump me or who knows what. Some of my friends are adamant that I encountered an unidentified serial killer of women who'd been operating near the area for a few years before I camped there. Now this would explain why he was so sinister but didn't kill me, although it wouldn't explain what his plan or motive really was. Now I genuinely have no idea, but the more years that passed, the more I'm certain that I narrowly avoided something terrible. I just can't decide if that fate would have been at the hands of the business guy or at the men who showed up at the end. And as much as I want to, I can't convince myself that I didn't just let dangerous people snatch up a vulnerable man. And it's kind of weird to actually hope for the fact that you spent multiple nights sleeping next to a predator, but I prefer that than to think that I'd let him down. I just wish that I knew for sure. Maybe I'm better off not knowing.